Hey guys, so I just received this. This is the BetaFPV Lite Radio free. This is an optional case you can buy with it as an accessory. And this is the radio controller. So I'm going to give this a quick review, let you know all the important facts about it, what I think about it, and who I think this is made for. So let's talk about maybe first about my first impression that I had when I got this thing out of the box. So interestingly, I saw some pictures of it before actually holding it in my hands, and I expected something different, I have to say. I expected this to be a bit more toy-like and smaller because it looks very toy-like on pictures, but in reality, holding it in my hands, it actually doesn't feel small at all. It's actually a rather, I would say, average size, or even maybe slightly bigger size for such a gamepad style controller. So this doesn't feel small at all. So you will not feel like holding a toy in your hands. And also, part of this first impression, for a $59 controller, this actually felt more high quality than I expected, except maybe the buttons. But I get into the quality, feel, and ergonomics in a second, but that was sort of my first impressions. I sort of really expected a toy. What I got is what I would say a solid beginner to intermediate radio, but let's dive into the details of this thing. So first, the ergonomics and the quality feed. So ergonomics, I would say this is maybe this is, maybe 30% for pinchers, 70% for thumbers. So when you're thumbing, this thing feels very comfortable, very nice. And obviously, I mean, this is subjective. It's going to feel differently depending on your hand, the size of your hands, your personal preference. So all I can tell is how I feel about it. That's all I can tell about it. So please be aware that this is always a subjective statement when I'm talking about ergonomics. So for thumbing, for me, it feels very nice. Pinching, I would say, still okay. So for me, when pinching, the position isn't quite as comfortable as it could be. Not exactly sure why. Maybe because it's quite short here, so my hands are sort of slipping off a little bit when I'm trying to get in a comfortable position. But it's actually very nice. I would say it's not for pinching. It's not as good as the Tango, which is very good for pinching in my opinion. But it's absolutely usable for pinchers too. And for thumbers, actually, it's really, really nice and comfortable in my opinion. So the gimbals. So obviously this is a cheap radio controller. I don't think these are Hall sensor gimbals. But to me, I mean, I don't really understand the whole Hall sensor gimbal stuff. To me, they all feel quite similar. And these feel sort of okay. They're not... There's no play or weird stuff here. This is all okay. They have maybe a slightly reduced travel. It's not very big, but also doesn't feel small either. So I would say these are just okay gimbals, which are going to be, and this is metal by the way, that's not plastic. These are going to be absolutely fine. So for me, these feel absolutely nice. No problem here at all. Now the buttons here, I think, well, these are okay. These are permanent switches here, which you can use for arming. That's sort of like on the Tango, but these switches here, they sort of feel mushy. There's not that much feedback. And I first tried to push it because you can sort of push them down a little bit. So I would not say not the most crisp switches here, these two, but for the price of the radio, they seem okay to me. So that's basically all I can say about ergonomics. Weight, this thing is very light, very light. I don't think it comes with a strap. Not sure if that strap is included or optional, but mine came with a strap, and I would say I don't really see why you would strap this around your neck. It hardly weighs anything. It's really comfortable to hold. So that would be my impression of the ergonomics. Now the quality on this thing, I mean, while it's not super stellar. It's sort of rubberized plastics, so it doesn't feel it doesn't feel like a yogurt container or something super cheap. It still feels high quality. It's like rubberized, soft plastic. It's got enough grip. Well, I mean, it's not impressive, but still, for the price, I would say this looks pretty good. I mean, as you can see, the mount here, this is machined aluminum. the sticks. If I zoom in on them, let me zoom in on that stuff. So this is all machined aluminum. This is also machined aluminum. So in terms of how it looks for a $59, like 50 euro roughly, radio controller, well, absolutely fine, I would say. There's not that much to be desired on top of that for that price. But maybe the most important thing about this radio controller is that it does come in two versions. There's a multi-protocol version and a ExpressLRS version, which is really cool to see, which what I was hoping for, basically, that ExpressLRS would replace all those FreeSky protocols, the 8016, on the BNF quads and sort of beginner radios and beginner BNF quads. I was hoping it would just replace that because it's much better, and it seems we're moving in that direction. So this thing does have an internal 2.4 gigahertz module, as you can see here. It's actually quite simple. If you want to bind the quad, the simplest way, in my opinion, to do is what they call the traditional way. You hit the bind button, you plug and unplug your quad 3 times until the receiver goes into bind mode, and then it will just work. That's the simplest way to do it. I'll show you the configurator this comes with in a second. You can also use this to bind it, but I think, just pushing the button is a very simple way to do it. As you can see, there's an ExpressLRS transmitter in there. It also has a module base. So you could, in theory, put a multi-protocol module on there, or Crossfire, or what you could also do, since you have 2.4 gig in here, you could have the 900 megahertz module, this 900 megahertz BetaFPV module. You could have the 900 megahertz on there, no problem. So it's actually pretty cool that this does have a module. But I have a 2.4 gigahertz module also, so you could have two different 2.4 gigahertz modules in there, which doesn't make any sense, but it's cool that it does have a module bay at this price point. Oh, as I said, binding is quite simple. You just hit the bind button here. But if you want to go to, as you can see, this doesn't have a screen, and I think this is a good thing. Nobody really needs a screen on and trim buttons and all the stuff on a controller for an FPV drone. But it does come with a proprietary configurator to access all the settings. So let's look at that in a second. I'll just have to get my laptop out to show you. Okay, so to get onto the configurator, all we have to do is plug in the radio controller, download this BetaFPV configurator. It's actually open source and on GitHub, so you can download it, connect, and here we go. And honestly, this is so much more comfortable than how we used to set up the radio controllers with OpenTX. Now, obviously, if you're going to use model airplanes too, or helicopters or something, you're going to miss a ton of features in this configurator. This is really only usable for FPV drones and pretty much nothing else. You're going to have a lack of features. But especially for the beginner, this is going to save you so much headache when getting familiar with OpenTX. So you have all the settings you need. You can switch this from the internal module to the external module bay. You can set up your power here on the internal ExpressLRS module. You can enable the bind phrase, which I actually rarely bother to do because, again, the traditional method just works also. And as you can see, you have your channels here. You can check that everything is fine. You can even change your channels here, adjust the mapping in case you want to. But you're actually going to need those settings quite rarely, I think. I wouldn't know what I would change here on a regular basis, but for your first setup, this is actually very nice, especially for beginners. Now, I think I'm not actually sure if this is still standard ExpressLRS that BetaFPV now runs on here. I think they forked the code actually, and so I'm not 100% sure how software updates are gonna work here. If you can actually make a build and put it on the controller through the regular ExpressLRS, but personally I wouldn't really care, especially as a beginner. As long as this thing works, bind your quad once and you're good to go. And I think some people will be annoyed by how ignorant I'm when it comes to this, but I think especially for a beginner radio, I personally wouldn't mind. Bind the quad, leave it as it is, good to go. So I don't think this is much of a problem that BetaFPV has their own configurator here. This is much easier to use, honestly, than the original ExpressLRS one. So I think this is, especially for who this thing is aimed at, that's actually a good thing. So what's the overall conclusion on the Lite Radio 3? Well, I would say this is a very, very good option for a beginner that doesn't want to spend a fortune, wants to get in on a future-proof protocol, and basically have all the options for most BNF quads that will come out. I mean, keep in mind that many companies are now jumping on this bandwagon. You can see this is a flywheel quad here. It does have one of the ExpressLRS receivers. And I mean, honestly, I think these receivers, I think I have a spare one here. These are so cool. I mean, just look at how tiny that thing is. And that's including the antenna, which is on there. So for all the micro stuff, the BNF stuff, ExpressLRS is just very cool if you don't want to spend a fortune. So I would say this is what I would recommend this for. And the nice thing about it for a beginner, I mean, this is a bit, this is going to last you for a while. It's not going to be your controller that after 2 weeks you sort of grow out of. This thing has ExpressLRS, as I said, so it's going to have decent range. You have a module base. You always have the option to add another module if you want to do more advanced stuff. It's super easy to use. You have the configurator, which you're probably not even going to need because you can just bind it with any quad as it is. So it works perfectly with this flywheel quad here right out of the box. I just bound it in the traditional way. Absolutely works. So I would say in this case, this is really something I would recommend, especially at this price point here. I mean, if you have a bit more of a budget, you might want to look into a Tango or the new, which I also have coming, the new Orca FPV controller. But if you're more, looking for something lower budget and you're interested in the cheaper BNF quads, you don't want to switch receivers or anything, and especially if you're looking for micros, this is a pretty cool option for a beginner. Downsides maybe, well, that's actually not, I mean, I wouldn't really know any big downside to this controller here. It doesn't have any major flaw or anything, honestly, except the buttons that don't feel great here, which is okay for what this thing costs. No really big downside here. Solid product, and it's nice to see that products in FPV do get better and more professional and just work. I mean, for my personal experience, I still had some issues with the very early BetaFPV stuff. I mean, both of these modules here are the very first series that came out that had a hardware issue where you cannot get into Wi-Fi mode to update the firmware and so on. But now I think a few months after this came out, now these products finally seem to have gotten really solid and working, no bugs, nothing. So this is absolutely cool for a beginner, I would say. All right, guys. I'll link all the stuff as usual in the video description below for you to check out. Obviously, it supports the channel if you click on those links. And I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated. Thanks for watching.